go ahead and get started. All right, so we are finishing up the last chapter. Well, not finishing up. We're starting the last chapter that's going to be on exam 2. All right, so this is Neorealism, the Italian Spring, post-war cinema in Europe. All right, so that's what this chapter is going to be on. So to kind of reiterate what's going to be on chapter 2, so today we're going over Neorealism in the Italian Spring, also cinema in France, and poetic realism, everyday realism, right? Post-war, American cinema and post-war, right? The introduction of sound. There's always a fifth one. I always forget the fifth one. What's the fifth one? I always forget the fifth one. Yeah, so chapter 6, 7, 8, 9. Always forget the fifth one. All right, anyways. So make sure that you're following, going iCollege. Everything is sort of deviated up by chapter, so just make sure you understand what chapters you need to study. Use my notes and my PowerPoint as a guideline on where to study in the textbook. Don't neglect to read the textbook. However, use it as a study guide. All right, so for example, I know a lot more about American film than I do about international film, which means there's probably more that you need to review in the chapters on American film than there are on international film, right? Just kind of give you a little hint about that. But once again, use my notes as a study guide. If I don't go over it in my notes, or if I don't mention it during my lecture, then you probably can, it's a safe bet that you can skip over it when you're reading that part of the textbook. Right? Does that make sense to everybody? But don't just neglect to read the textbook, right? Because a lot of times it puts it in context, easier to understand if you do that. But I will open up exam 2. I'll open up exam 2 next Thursday, I believe, is the day that I'm opening it up. I can double check that real quick. Yep, exam 2 is opening up October 29th, the day before. Is Halloween the 30th or 31st? I always forget. Okay, wow, there's like a hostility behind that. There's like frustration, anger, even.
I'm just surprised that you've been alive this long.
Perhaps, right? All those years that I've been alive. I think you just called me old. I think it's just.
Old?
I think that's what you called me.
Never. You
Never.
were great for 50.
Remind me your name again. Is it
Okay.
it's like Shay, come on.
Shasha.
I was close, but not.
What did you say? I got an exit.
Shasha. Here's the thing, Shasha. The reason why I forget is because I haven't seen you in a while. Where you been? Bro.
Yes.
How does that have to do? What does that have to do with? I'm not charging an admission for you to come inside the class.
Because it's in I gotta go all the way from Paulding County, gotta fill up that gas tank, and then I gotta come here, and then pay $5 for parking. Like, who has money like that?
I see what you're saying. Okay.
Wait, you're 50?
No. Where did 50 come from?
Oh,
I don't know where 50 came from, but yes.
I was like, what the hell?
I'm most certainly not 50. Close, but not.
Close.
Not close yet. But it's good to have you, Shay. Good to have you here. Good to have you.
Shay.
What did I say?
Shasha.
Oh no, Shasha. Are you switching it up on me? It was always Shasha.
Yeah, Shasha.
I'm sorry. I really do apologize. Shasha. Excellent. All right. But yeah, good to have everybody here. We'll start off with questions, concerns. All right, we'll go ahead and start with our warm-up question here. Name one thing that everybody seems to love, but you're just not a fan of. What's one thing? For me, I got a hot take, right? It's going to be very hot takey. So I'm expecting there to be a reaction, and it's totally fine, right? And I don't hate these things by any stretch of imagination. I just don't like how much people love them, right? So I don't hate them. I'm not that big of a fan of dogs, okay? Once again, that's hot takey.
How?
You're a white man.
I know, right? Yeah, you're 100% correct.
Weren't you a firefighter?
Oh no, yeah, no, you are 100% correct. I mean, I used to have a the dog was fine, right? She ran away, not because of me. She ran away. There was a storm. It wasn't even my fault. It was my wife's fault. There was a storm. My wife let the dog out during a storm. The dog ran away. She usually came back, right? Because we were like, if she ran away, like, oh, she's fine. She'll come back. I'm pretty sure she got hit by a car. That's my opinion. But yeah, I don't have a problem. If you like dogs, that's fine. I'm just saying, like, you can like dogs. I mean, I'm not crazy about dogs to the extent that a lot of dog lovers are, right? All right. But what about you?
Obsession over Apple products.
You don't like Apple products?
I appreciate them, but like the thing, how people make it their personality.
Okay, the obsession with Apple products. I don't have any Apple products. I don't even have an iPhone. Just because I think it has more to do with the fact that I feel like I'm too dumb to learn how to use a Mac. Like it's very frustrating. What about you? What else are some other things that you are? Yes, go ahead.
I understand obsession over like friends or like the office. I just
Oh, excellent.
I
Are you leaving in anger? Are you a fan of Friends or
both?
both
Literally
Friends
this morning when I got
and The
dressed,
Office?
I googled Monica,
Yes.
and this was the outfit.
Okay.
She said she doesn't like Friends. It's just not
You don't like The Office? Okay.
It's not really an
Yes, go ahead.
I don't like anime.
You don't like what?
Anime?
You don't like anime. All right, that could also be kind of hot takey, but I'm also not a big fan of anime. Once again, if you like anime, totally great, go for it. That's one of the nerd areas that I typically don't go into. Yeah. If you've ever gone to Dragon Con, right? There's all kinds of different fan communities, but there are certain anime communities that kind of like are in like the deep parts of like the hotels and everything. It's very interesting. Yes, go ahead. Mushrooms. Right, we're talking about just like regular mushrooms. Not a fan. What do you not like about mushrooms?
I don't know. I'm a textured person.
Oh.
And it reminds me of. This is gonna sound really weird, but like it reminds me of like feelers or something. I don't know, like the consistency.
Yeah. Okay. I can see that. So every time you eat a mushroom, you're thinking about, I'm eating an ear right now. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah,
I love mushrooms.
this might
I love.
be the most different.
Since I'm lactose intolerant, I can't have cheese. So what I do is I'll have a cheeseless pizza, but I'll have a lot of mushrooms on my pizza with some pepperoni. That no one liked that idea. No one was on board with that. What else? What are some other things that? Yes.
That sounds awful.
I really don't like ice cream.
You don't like ice cream at all? Any kind of ice cream?
See, like,
What is it about ice cream you don't enjoy?
I don't know if I'm lactose intolerant, but like when I eat ice cream, I feel it in my throat. I don't know, like I just feel it, and then I end up throwing up. So I just don't like ice cream.
Have you tried an alternative to milk? Because that's the type of ice cream I eat, like an almond milk ice cream or.
I used to not like milk, and now I only drink like almond milk. That's the only thing I
Well,
like.
there you go. The coconut milk ice cream is very delicious. I eat it very often. Yes.
I don't like cakes or cupcakes.
You like cake or cupcakes? I'm not that big of a fan of cake. I'm not really big a fan of like sweets, like desserts like that. Although a blueberry cobbler, I do like a blueberry cobbler. Huge fan. Yes.
You know, can we do this the opposite way?
Yes.
Because I really like sometimes whenever I like am just chilling, I will pour
Just chilling with your
myself.
friends, hanging out at the house,
Oh no,
not coming to class.
I'm being lonely. Because I literally just be chilling and I pour myself a cup of milk, and everybody's just like, "Ew," and I'm just like,
Because
"Why?"
that's disgusting.
Milk is literally so nutritious. My bones can outbone anybody's bones up in this piece.
Okay, sure.
Why? Because of calcium.
Your bones are strong.
They're amazingly strong, and nobody else likes to drink milk.
Right. Okay. Before I became lactose intolerant, I liked a glass of milk. I did enjoy it. Yes.
I guess I kind of have a slight bias, but I hate Cold Stone. It's an ice
Interesting.
cream place. I hate it. It could probably be like from me like working there, but like I just think Cold Stone ice cream is just so garbage. It just does not
You don't
taste
like
good.
it. Not a fan of the cold still.
I
What's your go-to ice cream place? Ice cream parlor, so to speak.
Oh, I like me some good Jenny's. Jenny's ice cream is really
Okay,
good.
interesting. I don't think I've ever heard of this place.
Jenny's ice cream is
Very
good.
good. What about Ben and Jerry. You okay with Ben and Jerry?
We stand Ben and Jerry's.
Ben and Jerry's is like the type of ice cream that you get when you're like, I have a little money to spend, but I don't want to spend on, like, I don't have enough money to spend on Haagen-Dazs at the grocery store, so I'll
Okay.
get Ben and Jerry's. Like,
Is Haagen-Dazs more expensive than Ben and Jerry?
yeah.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, did you have a hand up?
Yeah, I don't like pies.
You don't like pies?
I don't know.
Any kind of pie?
Like
All pies, okay. What's your go-to dessert
Ice cream.
then? Ice cream. All right, we have two sides of the coin here. No ice cream, ice cream.
I'll probably eat Ben and Jerry's, but it's specifically like I have to go to the Ben and Jerry's like store,
Yeah,
and there's one up in I think it's South Carolina that when we go to Myrtle Beach, that's where I go, and that's the only time I get Ben and Jerry's.
that's when you get it. Like, maybe like a waffle cone with it.
Yes, that's what I get.
All right, sounds delicious. All right, we'll do one more. What about over here? No? Yes, go ahead.
I don't know if y'all gonna know what it is, but it's like those like kind of utilitarian, like textile type vests, like a lot of rappers and stuff wear. I used to work in a clothing store, and like a lot of people would like come in and like, oh yeah, I got a music video, I'm trying to get this music. I just think it's cheesy.
You don't like it?
Yeah.
Do you think it's like ugly, or what about it? Is it too
It's
heavy?
trying too hard.
Trying too hard. Okay. Excellent.
I'm a fashion type person. Food and stuff, I try not to be too picky about food because I was really picky when I was a kid. So I just, I don't know. I find it annoying when like a whole adult,
Totally fine.
a
We're
whole
all adults
adult
here.
is like, I don't like pineapple on my pizza. I can't. It's my teeth are touching my foot. I don't know.
Okay. You don't like people that are too picky, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
All right. Excellent. Great. All right. So let's go ahead and move on. Describe the United States' relationship with Germany during this time period.
Awkward.
Sure. Yeah. What else? More practically speaking, what's the United States relationship? So this is post-war, right? Post-World War II. Yes.
It's strained.
Sure. Yes. Yes.
They were aiding Germany a lot and helping them like rebuild their country and stuff like that.
Right. Exactly. So yes, please.
There was like a divide in Germany because of the Berlin Wall, and West Germany was invaded by the U.S. and then East Germany was invaded by the communists. So there was like that divide between like communism and us.
Yeah, excellent. Great way to describe it. So this is after World War II, right? Germany lost the war, and the Allied powers have taken over Germany. They're kind of setting up their own sort of pseudo governments in Germany during this time period. And this really is a stronghold in the tension of the Cold War between the communist Soviet Union and communist countries in the East. And then the capitalistic West allies in the West. And Germany itself is divided in half. You have East Germany and West Germany, like you said. And this is sort of like the focal point of growing tension between the Western allies and the Soviet Union and communism. So we talked about this in a previous class about how after World War II, there is sort of this power vacuum, and what ends up happening is there's two developing superpowers that happen, right, that develop. The Soviet Union and the United States. And both of these countries are attempting to gain influence throughout the rest of the world, right? So the Soviet Union attempting to spread communism, the United States attempting to spread democracy, and there's this tension that's growing, right? And these influences from the United States and Soviet Union are making their way into Germany during this time. So yeah, so the United States during this time is attempting to create or to recreate Germany in our own image, right? That's kind of the whole point here. And sort of feeding in our ideology, kind of like this American ideology into Western Germany. And in terms of film history, this has a lot to do with the United States just pumping in films, right? Just attempting to spread, if you want to call it propaganda, spreading propaganda through just really exporting a bunch of films throughout Germany and all of Europe as well. So both countries kind of see this as the film industry as a way of sort of spreading propaganda on both sides. Right? Excellent. So what's modernism? So now we're talking about more of a more so than just an artistic movement, but more of a broader ideology, right? Like a period of time of modernism. Yes.
Isn't it like based on real life?
Yes, certainly. Yes. So it's based on real life. What else? How would you describe modernism? Yes.
They use montages and close-ups.
Yes. Yes. Close-ups. What else was the other thing you said?
Close-ups? Montages?
Montages. Okay. What else? Yes.
They use like long takes, like real big and
Yeah.
natural.
In terms of the artistic movement, they typically have longer takes. Right. Exactly. Modernism, in more general, is a sort of a rejection of the past, right? This embrace of progress, embrace of technology, this infatuation with what's new, and kind of a rejection of tradition, which makes sense during this time period in Germany when the Nazi government has power, and many other fascist regimes that have kind of controlled part of Europe during this time period. There would be this rejection of the past, right? This idea of progressive ideologies. But yeah, so more generally speaking, it's sort of like this idea of kind of rejection of the past and kind of looking forward. Next question. What is neorealism? We discussed this a little bit in terms of some of your answers, but how would you describe neorealism? Yeah.
It was like stories and movies based on like the poor or the working class family or people, and they were like very distinct things during that time.
Yeah, focusing on the impoverished, focusing on everyday life, sort of like focusing on the beauty of kind of the mundane, or focusing on the mundane of just everyday life, the way life is sort of repetitive and redundant, which is a huge difference from classical Hollywood cinema, which is sort of this like happy, like extravagant storytelling, happy endings, stories of love, right? Of people who are wealthy, right? Exactly. So this is very different from classical Hollywood cinema. How else would you describe neorealism? We'll get into it a little more once we get closer to it. Describe the Italian Spring. What is the Italian Spring? Very important political movement, but it also obviously had an influence on cinema. How would you describe the Italian Spring? Yes, go ahead.
The Italian Spring Offensive, also known as Operazione
Okay.
Primavera, was an offensive to the Greco-Italian War that lasted from 9 to 16th March 1941.
Okay.
Just
Right.
off the top of my head.
Sure, right. You read the textbook last night, and you're like, oh, I gotta remember
I
this
remembered it.
for our discussion session. Yeah, so more generally speaking, it might be beneficial to think of the Italian Spring as very similar to France's Popular Front, right? You have this leftist-leaning thinking where you're attempting to sort of reject the fascist ideas, of Mussolini during this time period. So you have this like kind of revival of progressive thinking, and you're seeing this in cinema as well, kind of reflecting back on the horrors of the war. We'll kind of talk about it in more detail here in a second. But yeah, very good. So let's go over some general information here. Reading off my notes. So in 1945, most of Europe lay in ruins, obviously because of World War II. Factories were destroyed, people lost their homes, not a great time to be alive, right? Most countries were in debt. As we mentioned before, the post-war was dominated particularly by the U.S. and the USSR. The Cold War between these two powers would affect the nation's internal politics. In 1947, the Marshall Plan was a plan with the United States where the United States essentially just dumped billions of dollars in aid to Western Germany in order to sort of boost the economy, and really to boost the economy, but also to recreate Western Germany in the United States' image. In 1952, there was sort of this great boom in Germany's economy. The United States started forming alliances. NATO was created in 1949. Obviously, there was this desire to get as many people on the side of like capitalism and American democracy. U.S. wanted to make Europe in its own image. Yet there's many examples of how some of these countries rejected that, and we'll kind of get into that. All right, so what I want to do is I wanted to show another. I like opening up some of our lessons with watching a part of a film, putting our film analysis caps on, and then there you go, tighten it up in the back, there you go. And then we can discuss it. So I'm going to show a clip from, this is actually the closing sequence from Germany Year Zero in 1948. We'll watch the film, or the clip I should say, I think it's pretty long, and then we'll have a discussion about it. What are some things that you noticed? What are some things you like? I got a thumbs up in the back. Excellent. But yeah, here it is. This is a clip from Germany Year Zero. There is a trigger warning. Not that it's, I mean, it's kind of laughable. But this kid, he does end up committing suicide. It's not very graphic, and in fact, you're probably gonna laugh. But I just want to let everybody know, right? You'll see what I'm talking about. All right. So if this is supposed to be an example of neorealism, what are some things that you notice about this clip? Yes.
Well, right before he killed himself, he just looked at like the landscape of where he lived and like all the destroyed buildings, just like the after effects of the war. And it kind of, and he's a kid, so for him to even see that and then decide to kill himself, it just lets you know how the rest of society probably felt too.
Yeah, great. That's a great way of putting it. You have this kid who is seeing the aftermath of the war, what it's done to like the terrain and everything, and he just ends up just giving up. Right? It's pretty powerful. Right? It's kind of like this like symbolic gesture of what the country is kind of going through during this time period. Yes.
At the end, it was very subtle, but the woman came around the corner and she picked him up, and then like she looked, and then her face kind of just like fell like, and then the camera went right up to like, whoop, bad guy, or to her wife.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. What else? Yes.
I know, like after like she said like the woman was looking at him, the train passed by, and I know like usually in like older films, trains have like a lot of meaning. I mean, usually they're like sexy, but
Yeah. Yeah, they do. Yes.
I don't know. I think maybe it could symbolize something else that I'm
Okay.
missing on.
Yeah, you're very correct. The trains often have have like a symbolic meaning. The obvious example of this, and I know you mentioned they often indicate sex. The famous example of this would be North by Northwest, when the two characters are, there's a cut, they're being romantic, there's a cut, and there's a train going through a tunnel, right? It's supposed to symbolize the act. But yeah. What else? Yes.
Um, the soundtrack for this scene, so it really reminded me. Recently I really got into 007 movies, and
Okay.
there's always in the soundtracks, which I really love about the movies. There's always a point where he either realizes something, like he realizes who the killer is, or he realizes some big plot. And the soundtrack sort of sounded similar, and it reminded me of that because like the soundtrack, it really focused, and his eyes really lit up when he realized what happened in the war and everything around him. It's like his brain just opened up, and he took in every all the hardships and everything.
Yeah. Yeah, excellent. It almost kind of reminds me of, was it Bird Box? You want to see Bird Box?
Yeah.
That's kind of what it reminds me of a little bit. Yeah.
You know, I was talking to my friend the other day, and
What friend? Who are you talking to?
his name is actually we're not gonna random. It's complicated in the
Oh, it's complicated. You're your friend.
and but he was telling me about like this thing called the call to the void,
Okay.
where it's practically like what happened with this little boy. He like
Sure.
looked out, and then instantly he he just decided to jump. But it's also like whenever you're driving and you're going really fast and you're just like, what if I just hit this wall right now?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. So like that's like kind of what just happened right there.
Okay,
Like
excellent.
call to the void.
Yeah, I agree with that, definitely. A lot of these films, a lot of times these films are called rubble films because they're often shown like in the aftermath of the war. You've seen a lot of destructed buildings and destroyed factories. Did you have a hand up?
Yeah, I thought the editing on the fall was kind of weird
Yeah.
because we generally see him like fall down to throw the strings right, like, and I think it affects how impactful it could have been had it was edited right.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think if you made it seem more funnier, but then more sadder when he actually jumps down and
Okay.
falls to the ground.
Yeah, great. Excellent. Yes.
Like into that makes it really weird because like the symbolism between like him being a little boy and him seeing the war and him feeling something different in like his soul
Mm-hmm.
versus like when you see like the ladies and they're like they have a little stroller with their baby and they're just walking past all of the destruction and everything and they act like everything's fine, but for him he just sees something different, and then they just cut to like him basically dying. Like it wasn't like the fall or
Yeah.
like it was just something different.
It's almost like this moral panic of look what this has done to our kids. Look what we have left for our children, sort of thing.
But it was different because like the he realized it, but the adults didn't. Like the adults were just like cool with it.
Yeah, you're right. Exactly. Great. Yeah, great. Great comments. All right, so let's move on. All right, so a couple more things that I want to discuss. Reading off my notes. After the war, the American companies strove to reintroduce their product into Europe. They formed the Motion Picture Export Association of America. Essentially, what this was a way for the United States to pump in as many American films as possible into Germany and the rest of Europe. Germany itself had sort of this rejection of the past as well. Many young directors were attempting to sort of separate themselves from the previous like Nazi propaganda films. They call them Papa's Kinos, I believe it's Papa's Kinos or Papa's Cinos. Not sure how you pronounce that K. But essentially this was, Papa cinema, right? This rejection of Papa cinema from like Nazi propaganda films. As I said, Western Germany received millions of dollars in aid. Superficially, the film industry seemed healthy as well. Production climbed, attendance surged. Many people call it West Germany's economic miracle, but it essentially established international competition in German cinema. Hollywood controlled large parts of distribution. It was permitted to use blind and block booking tactics already outlawed in the United States. Remember when we talked about block booking, where you could, if you had a theater, you could essentially control all the films that were shown in that theater. 2/3 of German theater screen time was occupied by American films. it should be safe to assume that this wasn't just the United States sort of forcing Germany to watch these films, but I think it's pretty safe to assume that German audiences actually enjoyed American films too. But some Nazi-era filmmakers were forbidden to work, but others were rehabilitated under alliance policies. Some Nazi supporters were given prestigious posts. But yeah, younger directors in the 1960s would attack and call for an end to Papa cinema. A type of, I don't know if you would call this a film movement or genre, is the Heimat film. The most popular German film genre following World War II, represented 20% of the domestic output. It often depicted a tale of village romance. A film called The Lost One in 1951. This film scrutinized the war and its effects. It used flashbacks to present a doctor haunted by wartime murders he committed. It stars Peter Lorre. You probably recognize Peter Lorre. He's in Casablanca, right? If you watched it already. He was in M. He was the killer in M, and he was also in Maltese Falcon, right? Very popular German actor. But this is The Lost One in 1951.
Ist das noch möglich? Ein Mann wie der Dr. Rode und so ein Kind. Machen Sie sich darüber nie keine Illusionen. Da gibt's nur eins. Schluss machen. Einfach Schluss machen.
As you can see here, the effects of World War II, not just the physical effects, but the psychological, like trauma, is in like the collective psyche, and it often manifests in film. All right, moving on to, let me see where I'm getting my notes again. Let's talk about modernism. Actually, let's go back here. So there was actually a resistance to the United States' influence in Europe. The U.S. started flooding European markets with American films. In 1958, France limited American imports and required that at least 20 weeks per year were devoted to French films. So you can start to see here that these foreign countries are attempting to sort of push back. Britain's new Film Act required that at least 45% of screen time be reserved for British film features. And then Italy's Entrietta law, 80 days per year would be set aside for Italian films. Governments began to fund film productions and other cash prizes. also helped also helped U.S. companies because the richer that they got, the richer the U.S. got. Co-production came into play, so French and Italian producers sort of forming alliances and spread financial risks. There was also some tech innovations. Do I have this up here? During this time period, the Aeroflex is one of the most noteworthy ones. This was a lightweight camera with large magazines and reflex viewing allowed cameramen to see during films. So this was a huge innovation where when you're filming, you can actually see what you're filming, which was a big deal. The Pansanor, I believe that's how you pronounce it, was a French inventor zoom lens that retained greater sharpness in all positions. All right, so let's talk about art cinema and the return of modernism. So European films competed internationally and won acclaim through film festivals. So although American films were very popular and generated a lot of money, European cinema was critically acclaimed and was often shown at film festivals. They are often considered like the shock of the new, so they were like this modernism. Modernism, like I said before, was this rejection of the past, rejection of tradition, experimenting with new art forms, experimenting with new technology. The modern impulse of the 1920s explored the German expressionism and Soviet montage, so it kind of looked at, although it was rejection of the past, looked at some older artistic styles like German expressionism and Soviet montage. Let's talk about three artistic and formal features of modernism. These artistic features are objective realism. So objective realism is sort of this like slice of life narratives that avoid Hollywood's type plots, refuse to eliminate the mundane, and lingered on nothing happens movement. So in Hollywood filmmaking and contemporary filmmaking today, there are a lot of cuts are intended to sort of cut out the things that are kind of meaningless, that don't actually drive the plot. Modernism is very different from that. Neorealism is very different from that. And it often sort of really just allows sort of this mundane experiences to be part of the film. Neorealists often would film in the street to emphasize current social problems. Although oftentimes they did film in the streets, they often used studio sets as well. Subjective reality is another characteristic of modernism and neorealism. So subjective reality is focusing on the psychological forces behind things and what drives a character to do what they do, in other words. So the use of flashbacks, sort of diving into the character's minds, their dreams, their fantasies. A great example of that in the clip that we just watched is you got the character, he's looking in a mirror, he puts his hand on his face and blood comes on his face, right? So it's sort of like this manifestation of the trauma that he's living through. And of course, there's authorial commentary. So an idea of an outside force constructing what the audience is supposed to see, sort of reflecting on things, giving a message, sort of the director or an outside force is presenting a message to the audience. Sort of pointing to things that you may not have noticed. So reflexive storytelling was also very popular, pointing it up to the film's own artifice and reminding the audience that the world we see is fiction. A clip that I want to show, this is from Stella in 1956. So the clip I'm going to show is a great example of all these characteristics of modernism. So the scene it's at the conclusion of the film, and you have these two lovers, and they're in a romance, and it just ends up not working out. But in the conclusion of the film, it shows these two characters, and they're with two other people, right? They're the guys with the new girl, the woman's with the new man, and they're dancing in different locations, but the cutting by the director is sort of implying that these characters really do belong together, right? Even though they're separate and it didn't work out, that maybe they actually do deep down deserve to be together. And I'll show that Flip right ahead. This is Stella, 1955.
Ξέρω, παιδί. Είσαι φίλος. Θα το κάψουμε απόψε. Νίξε, αδερφάκι, έλα κοντά. Ό,τι θες, Μίλτο. Ό,τι θες, μάτια μου. Γιασκίνη! Καλά, ρε Στέλλα. Μίλτο, ξέχασε τη Μίλτο. Δεν της αξίζει ούτε να τη σκέφτεσαι. Έχεις δίκιο. Θέλω να γίνει βιωτιάρη. Κάτι, για κάτι. Κάτι να τίποτε να αλλάξει φράγκο. Γεια σου, Μίλτο. Δεν μ' αρέσει καθόλου ο τρόπος του. Τουλάχιστον να φύγει νωρίς. Μήπως και η Στέλλα. Γεια σου, Μίλτο! Γεια σου, Μίλτο! Μίλτο, κορίτσια σαν τα κρύα νερά κάνουν αμάν για σένα. Μην το παίρνεις τόσο κατάκαλα. Κατάκαλα. Δεν με βλέπεις που γελάω. Σκέψου πόσος κόσμος γελάει απόψε. Λένε πως ο Μίλτος έγινε ρεζί. Την έσκασε η ρήτη και γελάει. Μίλτο! Ας τους να γελάνε. Αχ, Γλέντι, που έχει να γίνει απόψε. Όπα! Έλατε, παιδιά.
All right. So as you can see here, you can see how one may interpret this as the director saying these two characters deserve to be together, or they would rather be together. And actually, the cutting is sort of simulating the two characters dancing with each other. A couple of things I want to say about modernism is that they often had ambiguous endings. So the film would typically encourage the spectator to speculate on what might otherwise have happened, different interpretations. Let's focus on Neorealism and the Italian Spring. Oh. The most important film trend of this era is most certainly Neorealism. The fall of Mussolini's government, the U.S. companies tried to secure U.S. dominance of the markets. Cinema emerged as a force of cultural renewal and social change. Italians were eager for something new, as you might suspect, from a country which was sort of controlled by a fascist regime. Neorealism, you can often consider to be just kind of like new realism, focusing on the life of the working class, would often use non-actors. This is actually a very important characteristic of neorealism. Most directors would use non-actors, and in the case of Bicycle Thief, that is most certainly the case. So rather than hiring professional actors, they would just find people off the street and use them in their film. They would often focus on the beauty of everyday life. Does anyone else know what other film artistic style used non-actors? I know it's in the notes. What other film artistic style used non-actors? Does anyone remember that? Because I know it was on the last test.
The Russian montage.
Yeah, so montage. Excellent. Why was he focused so much on that? Bob's probably going to be on the exam. All right, moving on. What was that? What happened? So Italy was eager to break with old ways, aiming for like a left liberal ideas. Although many times people consider these to be like filmed on the streets, and sometimes that was the case. Many times they were actually filmed in studios. Moving on. Another very important characteristic of neorealism is most times they were the dialogue was post-dubbed. So in the case of Bicycle Thief, actually the act you don't hear the actual actor's voice. It was later redubbed by another actor. These stories were often resistant to both fascism and Allied occupation. So not only was there resistance towards fascism, there's sort of almost like this resistance towards like classic Hollywood's like invasion in the country. Often focus on social problems. The Bicycle Thief, which is one of the films that I expect you to watch, it just so happens that all the films that I require for you to watch in their entirety, most of them are on exam 2. But yeah, that's just kind of the way it worked out. The Bicycle Thief is a story of a worker whose livelihood depends upon his bicycle, right? So he's desperate for a job, he finds a job, and the only way that he can do this job is if he has a bicycle. So when his bicycle gets stolen, he's kind of out of luck. And the whole film is about him trying to find his bicycle back. Because if he lost his bicycle, he lost his livelihood and his ability to take care of his family. Sean, did you have a question?
I was gonna ask if it was meant to be like a tragedy.
Yeah, I would say there's definitely some tragic elements to it, right? But more so than that, it's focusing on like the actual, real social problems that everyday people are facing, rather than classic Hollywood cinema, which is like this fantasy escapism that you would associate with classic Hollywood cinema. The Italian Spring was relatively short-lived. It actually ended in 1948. Liberal and left-leaning parties were defeated at the polls. A few neo-realist works were popular with the public during the time, although many contemporary film directors are heavily influenced by Italian realism, or I should say, neo-realism. Particularly Martin Scorsese is heavily influenced by Italian cinema during this time period. The Catholic Church actually condemned films for their portrayal of sex and working class life. And then leftists attacked the films for lack of explicit political commitment. So sort of both sides rejected Neorealism. So the leftists thought they weren't doing enough. They weren't saying they weren't, it wasn't propagandist enough. And of course, conservatives thought it was too risque. I do want to show another scene, or from a clip from Four Steps in the Clouds. We can once again put our film analysis caps on. What I want to do is I want to show this clip. It's an extended clip. Right there. Put it on, tilt it, tighten it back, and then we can talk about it. All right, this is a clip from Four Steps in the Clouds. That's not it. Oh, I wanted to show that one too. Do I not have it set up? Oh, here it is.
Duerme, duerme, duerme.
Maybe I do need to set this scene up a little bit. So this is about a pregnant woman who was abandoned by her boyfriend. I'm sorry, I'm showing the wrong clip. Yeah, I'm showing the wrong clip. Here it is. This is a pregnant woman who's abandoned by her boyfriend. She doesn't have a ticket on a train. And an agent helps her on her stay on the train. She asks this random man who helps her on the train to come with her to meet her parents, saying that he is her husband, just to save the girl's honor, and that's what this movie is about. So here's a clip from that.
Bravo, sempre cavaliere, le belle ragazze. Facciamo passione.
This translation
Io se Dio vuole non ho compassione di nessuno. Magari me ne sto qui in corridoio perché questo lo tengo occupato e non lo cedo a nessuno. E no, perché mi voglio di mettermi sedere, non ragione per questo. Non è mica male la ragazza, eh? Che ragazza? Che ragazza? È carina, mi esce tutto il posto. Ma le puoi guardare, puoi guardare, guarda. Non è che belle cammine. Proprio voglio di guardare le campette delle ragazze. Perché mi piacciono le ragazzine di bianco? Io sono uno specialista. E ogni volta che io monto in treno mi faccio un giro di esplorazione e quando trovo un tipo adatto, io lo faccio. A dove là? Una volta? Dietro, signori. Un momento. Dietro, signorina. Guarda.
Non capisco, l'aveva messo qua, ha detto pazienza.
Ma siete sicuri di aver fatto?
Come? Sicurissima. Non le posso dire che l'avete detto.
E allora?
Ma non lo so. Dove l'ho messo?
Beh, sentite signorina, io non ho tempo da perdere. Se non l'avete trovato, bisogna fare un altro. Dove siete diretta? Lasciatelo cercare con calma. Può darsi che lo ritrovi, vediamo. Ma che può darsi? Può darsi. Non posso mica passare qui tutta una giornata. Io ho gli altri scompartimenti da controllare. Andate negli altri scompartimenti e tornate qui. Se la signorina non avrà trovate il biglietto, ce ne tornate. Poi no. Non mica bisogna che mi diciate voi quello che devo fare. E invece fare di sì. È assurdo fare pagare un altro biglietto se poi ritrovarli subito. Ma è assurdo. E io sono assurdo. Dove siete dirette? Avete visto? Avete detto di essere abbonati, vero? Già. Favorite il libretto di abbonamento. Anche voi, guarda.
All right. So 1949, the Andreotta Law, I just want to kind of reiterate this. It limited the imports and screen quota provided loans to production films, or production firms, or say. Films had to be approved, they had to be apolitical, and could not slander Italy. Let's see here. Neorealist form and style, so innovations in filmmaking like post-dubbing, like I said before, the voice of the protagonist in Bicycle Thief was provided by another actor. The movement's important lay in its ability to make characters' personal problems gain universal significance. So once again, it was a focus on a character's personal hardships or personal problems, but then sort of like reflecting this is kind of like all our problem. We're all dealing with this right now. Neorealism often thought to be shot on location, but most interior scenes were filmed in careful lit studios. They were sort of a rejection of classic Hollywood cinema, but there was some like influence, particularly the way the way it's edited, often followed classic Hollywood style. Films often skipped over important causes for events, but then also sort of focused in on mundane, everyday experiences. This is Umberto D in 1959. This is the one I want you to put your film analysis caps on. So we'll watch this clip. This film was mostly acted by non-professionals. This is a film about a housemaid who finds out she's pregnant. And this is the morning after. that's our example, our illustration of neorealism. What are some features that you notice? Yes, sir?
Is this an actual actress or is this someone that you got off the street?
I'm assuming this is a non-professional.
Okay, cool. But that's what I was gonna ask me. I was just like, what are you doing?
It was really good. Like I like the way it was shot, but some scenes I was just like, it was too long for what they were showing. I mean, do you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah, and that's deliberate, right? That's a deliberate choice by the director, is to really just really prolong it as much as the audience can take it, right? Just to kind of show like the mundane routine that she has every morning, and how that's sort of disrupted by this idea that she knows that she's pregnant, right? You can see that in the tears, right? Just really kind of forcing us as an audience member just to kind of live her everyday routine and not sparing us the detail by cutting. Most certainly, you can see that. Yeah. All right, good. All right, so before we go, I want to leave you with a little forward from Martin Scorsese on the bicycle thief. Remember the bicycle thief? It's not available on Swank. It's available on Canopy. You can still watch it with your Georgia State login. So make sure you watch this film. But this is a little forward from Martin Scorsese on the bicycle thief.
Hello, I'm Martin Scorsese. I'll be here every Friday night this month introducing some of the Italian films we cover in my documentary about my own experience with Italian movies. Our next film is The Bicycle Thief, and it's one of the pillars of neorealist cinema. These movies, made by a group of Italian filmmakers in the years following World War II, had an impact that's still being felt today. The critic, Lindsay Anderson, who later became a director, wrote about neorealism in 1948. He asked, "What is it about these Italian pictures that makes the impression they create so overwhelming?" Anderson answered his own question. He said the key to these films was first, their tremendous actuality, second, their honesty, and third, their passionate pleading for what we have come to term human values. No director expressed those values better than Vittorio De Sica, and very few films have been as meaningful to as many people as The Bicycle Thief. It was seen all over the world for many years, especially in the 1950s and 60s. The Bicycle Thief was considered the peak moment, the pinnacle of neorealism. To me, these movies define the most precious moment in film history, when for the first time, illusion took a back seat to reality. The performers in The Bicycle Thief were not actors. They were ordinary people De Sica found in the streets of Rome. The story is modest. The pace is deliberate, as we follow a father and son searching for a stolen bicycle. It's a small thing, perhaps, but it means the world to them, and their story helped change the course of cinema. Vittorio De Sica's The Bicycle Thief.
All right, thank you, Martin Scorsese. All right, before we go, just want to remind everybody that exam 2, I didn't remember the five chapters. All right, so introduction of sound, the Hollywood studio system, right? That was the other chapter I couldn't think of. Post-war in America, post-war in Europe, and then neorealism, which we just went over there. All right, those are the 5 chapters for exam 2. Any questions about anything before we go? Yes?
That's not a question, but like I just Googled bicycle thief and it's on HBO Max.
It's on HBO Max as well.
Yeah.
All right, excellent. Well, there's another option for you. But once again, it's definitely available to you via Canopy for free. Just log in with your GSU account. All right. Have a good one, everybody.